Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, you can check out the Poketown store. You can also get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are looking at another updated Sword and Shield deck. This time, it is based around a tag team that we're fully aware of in Mewtwo, but it seems from what we can tell in the Japanese meta so far, Mewtwo really has adapted. Yes, there are still going to be welder-based builds in the Sword and Shield meta, but one of the archetypes that's come out quite strong, and possibly is the more popular variant of Mewtwo these days, is a more psychic-based build that has a lot more disruption elements to it, thanks to some new additions from Sword and Shield. So let's jump into the basic concept, go through the list, and run it all down. So, like I said, that basic concept is that Turn 1 rule changes actually will be affecting Mewtwo quite a bit. Now, I think this affects Mewtwo a little bit less than it would something like an Ability Zard, because you can still churn out 300 damage by using one welder on your second turn, going first, and still do 300. So this is less so the case than it is Ability Zard, but Mewtwo was still affected. Many builds were just playing 4 supporters. Some were just, playing the 4 welders and then whatever, 1 or 2 other tag call engine type cards. So at the end of the day, welder was still like the main focus of the build, and with Turn 1 rule changes, that could end up being a little bit detrimental to the list. And since the Sword and Shield rule change, it looks like a lot of the Japanese player base has moved to more conventional support accounts and a different style of energy acceleration, which is Malamar. And the reason why we like using Malamar is because there are some great Psychic-type Pokemon that we like to attack with. As you know, even in the Welder builds of Mewtwo, you oftentimes see basic Psychic Energies or Rainbows just to use some Psychic-style attackers. In this list, we're going all out on Psychic-style stuff. And one of the main reasons why Trevenant is possibly the most powerful tag team that we can be using with Mewtwo these days is because of the new Marnie supporter from Sword and Shield. Marnie is essentially an overpowered version of Judge. Both players shuffle their hands and put them to the bottom of their decks. We get to draw 5, your opponent gets to draw 4. So if you force your opponent down to a random 4-card hand, and then you use a Night Watch attack, which does 150, and shuffles 2 random cards from their hand into their deck, you leave your opponent with essentially a 3-card hand after they draw for turn. And that can be super disruptive against a lot of archetypes. Again, I'm going to bring the Turn 1 rule changes into effect. The game literally is changing in terms of what your opponent is able to do and what they can't do. And it basically, this deck capitalizes on that in some instances. If you're the player going second with this Mewtwo list, you can use a Turn 1 GX attack with your Gengar&mimikyu. You can use Horror House. And then, obviously, they are not able to play a card. They weren't able to play a supporter on the first turn. And then, when it comes back to your second turn, if you can get some acceleration via a Malamar, you can go straight into that Night Watch attack, combine it with a Marnie, and leave your opponent with a 3-card hand size. So, it's actually quite reminiscent of something like a Tina Chomp deck that tries to blow up a bunch of Miss Magius and reset stamp your opponent early. It's just doing that in a slightly different form, and obviously not feeding your opponent prize cards either in the process. So in many ways, that's a little bit more favorable. So you can see the new combination. We have a great supporter card that disrupts your opponent and still gives us a reasonable hand to play with, and it combines with Trevenant very, very nicely. And the final real factor here is that we get much better ball search in this format. Quick Ball and Treasure are both, discard 1 to find a Pokemon. The amount of Psychic Pokemon we play in this list means it's very, very versatile. The Treasure obviously helps us get our Malamars out as well, and Quick Ball can access all of our sort of tag team tech attackers, our Mewtwo's, Dedenne, of course. So these are all great cards that have amazing synergy with Mewtwo, of course, because we like pitching Pokemon as quickly as possible. We like pitching Psychic Energy, so this deck really can motor through things. You want to put a lot of stuff in your bin, lower your deck size as quickly as possible, whilst also searching out the important Pokemon at the right time. So there's just obvious synergy here. Malamar gets stronger in a vacuum because he's more searchable, and that's just overall good news for him. So yeah, it seems to be a good way to adapt Mewtwo overall. Let's look at the Pokemon. Now, there's a lot on this slide, as you can imagine, with Mewtwo and Mew. There's always a heap of attackers that you try and synergize here. I'll go through the top line first and then talk about the reasons why we have all these one-offs on the bottom line. So 3 of our main attacker, Mewtwo and Mew. Perfection, being able to copy the attacks of all of those GXs on the bottom row there. It also has the Miraculous Duo GX attack, which is way more live every game now because we are always running Psychic Energy cards. So you do 200 for that 2 Psychic and a Colorless, and if you have an extra 1 attached of any color energy, but we only play Psychics in here, so 4 energy, you can heal all the damage from all of your Pokemon. Now that's actually quite relevant. There are some, certainly some archetypes out there that can't one-shot your Mewtwo&Mew. There are defensive builds of Zacian. There are also like Sableye Obstagoon based decks. So being able to fully heal your dudes is really awesome. Additionally, this is important to note when you're up against some sorts of Mimikyu based decks that like to place some counters on your guys. Obviously the Perfection ability does get shut off, but Miraculous Duo is still live. You can do that Miraculous Duo and then fully heal your dudes. And hopefully that means that it's going to be more difficult for them to sort of reactivate their Mimikyu, especially if you combine it with Shrine, or sorry, with your Swell to stop Shrine ticks from happening. So that can also be a really important option in this build, because I mentioned that Horror House can be a great GX attack. We have a few other situational GX attacks, but there's not really one that you use every game like you do in the Welder-based build, where you try and do the 4 energy 300 basically every game. With the Welder Mewtwo. In this list, it's a lot more flexible what sort of GX attack you go for. A Miraculous Duo is certainly an option there. We have 1 copy of Indeedee V. This is a new Sword and Shield V Pokemon, of course. It has the Watch Over ability that says once during a turn you may heal 20 from this active Pokemon, or your active Pokemon, which is pretty nice. Again, this is a nice defense around people just trying to put a damage counter or 2 here or there on your guys, and just trying to tech a little Mimikyu with Shadow Box to shut down your Mewtwo's, which is always pesky. In general, it's a bit of extra healing, which is never a bad thing, but also this is another Psychic type that can come in and start swinging if need be. It does 10 plus 60 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active, so that's a nice way to get through Keldeo, which is obviously very good for us, because this is a V Pokemon and not a GX. It's also just a card that can hit Mewtwo&Mew for weakness in mirror matches, whilst also having a dark weakness itself, so it forces real attacks from the opponent to respond to KO, and it's only a 2-prize Pokemon as well, so it can be used to skew prize trades. So it's a bit of a multi-purpose card, even though it's not something we can copy with the Mewtwo. It sort of stands up on its own as a decent option. We have 2 Jirachi. Our board space is quite tight, because you have... Sometimes you can start one of these derpy tag teams or anything like that, and they can take up a bench space for you. Then you've got to have your Mewtwo, then hopefully like at least 2 Malamars, usually a Dedenne change in there as well. So we naturally don't really have space for many more Dedenne changes or Stellar Wishes. So normally you want to have exactly 1 Jirachi on the board, but this still has great synergy with like your Mallow&Lana and switching options in general. And obviously, again, I'll reiterate, first turn rule changes do change a lot about the game in general, and just having a good Stellar Wish start can get you towards Ball Search, and that means we can get Inkay's down turn 1, it means we can get Mewtwo down turn 1 and get energy attachments on him as well, and that's obviously very important. Dedenne, as we all know, discard synergy is fabulous. We want to get these Pokemon into our hands so we can bin them with Dedenne change. Also, binning Psychic Energies early on is great. So we have a lot of discard in the deck. We have the Professor's Research and the Dedenne change, so we really do cycle quite a lot with this build. A 3-3 Malamar is all we really need, I think. Again, board space being the biggest issue here. We have such great Ball Search for the Inkays. Just like in the early days of Malamar, where you had Treasure and Nest Ball. Now we have Quick Ball and Treasure, so you often have easy ways to access 1 or 2 Inkays. And really, as long as you get a manual attachment on your Mewtwo, 1 or 2 Inkays is absolutely plenty, because we can start using Night Watch that following turn, which is always good news for us. On to these attackers now. I've mentioned Trevenant quite a bit. He's the main sort of combo that we go for here. It's what makes us a disruptive-based Malamar, really. That Night Watch attack does 150, and you force your opponent to shuffle 2 cards from their hand back into their deck. Combine that with Marnie, it's going to make life very awkward for the opponent. Sometimes they just end up passing into you, or not having the sort of right turn that they're looking for, especially if they are a setup-based deck. Going to be really annoying for any sort of evolving deck, including the VMAX stuff coming out. Basically, all the regular V Pokemon just have sort of like vanilla attacks that aren't all that impressive. They're just waiting to evolve up into that VMAX and start doing powerful things. Well, this Trevenant really does ruin their day in certain circumstances, just because it gives them way less playable hands, which is decent. 150, good enough to two-shots, opposing tag teams and stuff. Not quite enough to two-shot like VMAXs, but like I said, that disruptive element can stop them coming into play in the first place. And we have so many other attacks that we can use that it does enough to put things in range of other attackers that we have in the deck, which is always great. And let's not sleep on Pale Moon GX. We've seen Malamar decks pre-Sword&Shield tech in Trevenant into their lists because we know how strong Pale Moon GX can be against some opposing Mewtwo players sometimes, but also against ADP. This can be clutch. You can see I've got the Latios GX there as well for potential clear visions, but Pale Moon GX can also be a great option here, where you can just discard the energies from your opponent's active guy, which can be pretty handy for you. So yeah, you can deny an ADP either with Clear Vision or with Pale Moon, which brings me onto the Latios quite well. Having that Clear Vision GX I think is important. ADP Zacian is certainly going to be a popular archetype, and other ADP lists could certainly be out there. So just Clear Visioning is oftentimes a decent option here. And Tag Purge, never too awkward in like mirror match situations or against Pika ROM. There are certainly spots where Tag Purge can be the best option for you, especially if you're using it to knock out things like Jirachis on your opponent's active, and you can just be nice and safe in that regard, which is pretty cool. We have that Gengar&mimikyu Tag Team GX. Horror House is the biggest reason why we have this guy in here. So if you're the player going second, you oftentimes try and weave in that Horror House if you can, just by manually attaching to your Mewtwo. It means that they've not been able to support her on turn 1 and then not been able to play any cards on turn 2. That buys you time to evolve up into your Malamars. That buys you time to get more manual attachments and more Pokemon in your discard pile. It gives you a lot of time to just cycle through your own deck as well. So you're filtering cards, you're buying a turn, you're getting extra attachments, and your board stay overall more set up, which can only be a good thing. And also it sort of protects your Mewtwo a little bit, even though it's in the active. So it really is a nice tempo option against people to slow them down. Poltergeist, you know, it's a panic button option if you have no other way to take a knockout. That can still be a great way for you to close out games if really need be, but that is pretty risky, of course. Dragonite GX does 270 for 5. That's the main reason why he's in here. 270 is still good enough against a lot of tag teams. Tag teams aren't disappearing from the metagame at all, so having 270 available is pretty decent. MegaLopun't, again, decent card, pretty good against Pika ROM specifically, which is coming back in a big way with some of the new cards from Sword&Shield. So having Jumping Balloon available is pretty solid. Good against, again, Mewtwo's and all sorts of other decks that still are running tag teams, or at least Dedenne-based engines. This can still put a good shift in. And Puffy Smashers is a nice sniping option, so if you happen to prize Naga, you always have a different way of accessing your opponent's bench. Naganadel mainly in here just for that Venom shot, so that we can target bench Pokemon, again, things like Dedenne and such, or finish things off that have sort of tried to hide after we've hit them once. And finally, we have the Solgaleo&Lunala Tag Team GX. Rarely seen as a card, but we do gain Light of the Protector GX if we really want to. For example, if we're under Power Plant and stuff, so we can't use Miraculous Duo, we could maybe go for Light of the Protector. So just a free energy thing, so we can basically bench this Solgaleo&Lunala, double Malamar and attach to him fairly reasonably and just get 200 out of nowhere, which could be nice. But he's also a great card for the Cosmic Burn. I think that's the main reason why I've put him in here, so that he can one-shot Zacian, and not many of these other attackers can do that without the big commitment of Sky Judgment with Dragonite. So having that 4 energy guaranteed knockout on Zacian is pretty nice. Obviously, Zacian can sometimes play things like Frying Pan and put you back out of range, or the Giant Charm, but if you're up against ADP Zacians, which are usually more aggressive with things like Fine Band in their list, the Solgaleo&Lunala can come in clutch. I think the Solgaleo&Lunala is probably the most flexible one-of here, so if you feel like there are other one-ofs attackers that you want to play, or you just want to gain a space in your list, that's probably the most flexible of the bunch. I think all the rest are pretty solid. Also, you can go down to 1 Trevenant if you really want to, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially because I don't play any things like Weak Guard or, again, Stealthy Hood in this list, anything like that. So, essentially, if you are up against things like the Mimikyu, or if you're up against Malamar, or other attackers that hit for Psychic weakness, you can have these 2 physical Trevenants swinging because they have a Dark weakness instead. So I like having those 2 copies, especially because every game you want to be able to use a Night Watch. So yeah, that rounds out the Pokemon overall. Onto the trainers, a lot more simple here. We've got 2 Great Catcher as our only means of gusting. It's a little bit risky because there are some potential Doll decks out there. So you could think about adding a Fion into this list for certain. But Great Catcher is going to be the option that we go for here. I'm playing 2 Switch, obvious synergy with Malamar. Your energy attachments are from the bench, and we have Jirachi synergy here as well. 2 Tackle to filter out our Pokemon so we can start binning the Trevenant and the Gengar&mimikyu really early. It does help us get that early Horror House very often, and we have a couple tag team supporters in here as well. Those 4 treasures, as well as the new Quick Ball. If you're not familiar with Quick Ball, you're going to have to get used to it because this card is crazy good. You discard a card and just go ahead and grab a basic and put it straight to hand. That means it has great Dedenne synergy, as well as finding all of our other basics. There's a whole heap of them in our deck. I'm then playing 2 Escape Board again to support that little Jirachi package. It can also find its way onto things like Inkays and stuff on those opening turns if you really need to. You can also use it on Latios or something like that if you're up against like an Absol and still get a free pivot, which is decent. And I'm playing 2 Chaotic Swell, obviously to deny Power Plant at times, deny Shrine if people are playing Mimikyu, and at the same time you're also just denying Prism Star Stadiums from the Fire decks and the Thunder decks as well, the Lightning decks. So yeah, Chaotic Swell, just a decent card overall. So shouldn't be too surprised to see it in Mewtwo. Onto the supporters, I really do have a thin tackle package, playing no Guzhala here, just playing the 1 Sinlin and the 1 Mallow&Lana. A bit of extra healing here and there is always nice, and it's another switching option for us to, again, help us reload energy attachments with our Malamars, which can sometimes be a great deal for us. Like I said, only 1 Mallow&Lana, because we also do have that Miraculous Duo option available to us for the absolute, like, full Stonewall heal of your entire board, which is pretty crazy. So I initially sort of wanted to have a second Mallow&Lana in here as well, but I just figured if I'm going to be in a sort of tanky matchup, we can try and just get that duo off instead. And then we have 4 of the best supporters here. Marnie, that big disruption supporter that we can use alongside the Trevenant, and of course the new Professor's Research that is just a discard hand, draw 7. Obvious synergy with getting Psychics and your Pokemon in the bin, and getting you a good hand size as well to work off of from then on, which is just obviously good. To round things out, we're just playing 10 Psychic Energy. I think it's a pretty solid number to find early on for attachments, have a decent number to Quick Ball away, or Professor's Research away, all that good stuff for our Malamar synergy. So overall, pretty happy with this very simple Psychic Energy count. You could think about adding in some extra special energies, but do bear in mind that Trevenant is one of your main attacks that we have in the list, and he is pure 3 Psychic Energy in his Nightwatch attack cost. So that's why I'm just playing pure Psychic Energy, because I really do feel like that is the focus of these Japanese-based builds. Onto the full list now. You can pause if you want to. It's also in the description below, as always. So we'll move on to tech options now. I've mentioned a couple of these during the video. Fion certainly can be nice if you're expecting some Doll-based decks or some more non-GX-based variants. Just Woolpool suctioning things out the way can sometimes be nice. Absol can also be an awesome addition because, again, we are trying to be disruptive with our Marnie plus Nightwatch combo. You can try and shut down your opponent's Jirachis, so they're not just an easy way out back into a good hand. At least force them to, waste manual attachments and whatnot onto their Jirachis if they already have an escape board established. Cherish Ball is definitely a card that I'm really thinking of. I'm actually low-key thinking of trying to remove this Jirachi package. I like having the Jirachi package possibly for like mirror matches and just in general being a good card to have in play if you just happen to get into it on those opening turns, especially going first and whatnot. But Cherish Ball is certainly like equal as an option here. Just to give yourself additional outs to find a Dedenne. It also gives you just better search options for some of these other GX Pokemon. We don't really have an easy way of discarding things like Dragonite or Naganadel because they're not basics. Actually, we do have treasure for those ones. It's things like... actually, you know what? Everything is pretty much covered with these. But Cherish Ball is just more additionals for, getting these in the bin quickly. And also more outs for Dedenne. So that is something to bear in mind. Custom Catcher could be an option. I think if you were playing customs, I'd also think about the new Oranguru to try and protect them because our deck is full of discard options. And I think the reason why I'm not playing customs right now is just for exactly that fact. We have so much discard synergy. I don't want anything to hold me back from cycling through this deck as quickly as possible. And Oranguru is a bit of a costly bench space, so that's why I'm not going for that right now, even though many other decks will be going to that Custom Catcher route. If you're not a fan of the Jirachi build, even though it is a tiny little mini package that we got going on here, you can go for a Dawn Wings Air Balloon option instead. Having Invasion Retreat is obviously very good for your Mewtwo. I do want to try this build out a lot as well, just because A lot of the time I sort of strand my Mewtwo there with like 3 energy, then it goes to a manual attachment to the 4th energy, to like Miraculous Duo, or to use my Solgaleo&lunala, and then it slowly builds up to the Dragonite while I'm hopefully recharging one on the bench and getting that ready to go. But if you have that Dawn Wings, you just have more explosive options. You can be sat there with a 2 energy or 3 energy Mewtwo in the active, and you're immediately threatening like a big Dragonite the future turn, just because you can easily just invasion retreat, and your opponent can see that, and it makes them play differently, basically. So Dawn Wings can be a pretty decent option there. It's a little bit weaker to Power Plant, where this deck is already fairly weak to Power Plant, so something to bear in mind. But overall, I think it's a decent option. You can still play a couple switches in addition to the Dawn Wings Air Balloon option as well. Air Balloon, as well as a couple other tools, could be considered in the deck. Stealthy Hood, like I've already mentioned, for Mimikyu, if you're scared of that. I think we can just use some of our other attackers, like physically attaching to Trevenant and such, if you do face a matchup like that. Also, Giant Charm can certainly be an option in here to give ourselves a little bit more hit points. Zacian, oftentimes with ADP, they can reach 260 naturally, and then they have things that can put 1 counter on, be it Fine Band, be it Zigzagoon, be it Shrine. So having the Giant Charm on your side can put your Mewtwo out of range that little bit more, which can be great. Viridian Forest gives us more discard synergy and more access to Psych Energies to just make sure we keep having manual attachments each turn, which can be a good deal. And Weak Guard is an additional option that you can think about, especially if you're worried about opposing mirrors or more non-GX based Malamars. One quick anecdote on like non-GX based Malamars, I think, because Zacian is going to be such a archetype that's already playing sometimes Luke Metal and the Frying Pan. They have so much reduction that I think regular Malamar probably has to adapt a little bit, and more often than not, I imagine Mew 3 builds to be the most popular builds of Malamar going forward. So that's just something to bear in mind. But Weak Guard still could be good if we see more sort of tried and trusted, like single prize Malamar-based builds. Onto the matchup overview, I think the regular Malamar would still be an issue, but like I said, I think there are other matchups coming out in Sword and Shield that really stamp Mally tags out of the meta, so that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on. Tina Chomp I also think can be awkward because they can easily play these sort of stamp combos against you early on, which can be pretty rough, and at the same time they normally play that Mimikyu and they can set up damage with Roxy and such, so that can be a little bit frustrating at times. Florgus dolls, as well as the Morpeko dolls decks, I think those are very awkward, especially for this list right now, because I'm not playing Morpeko. I'm not playing Fion, so you can't have easy ways around those dolls, which is a little bit awkward at times. Persian Box, I think, is also awkward because we are mainly trying to get our value from Disruption, and Persian obviously can get around that with its own ability, and it has a bunch of draw on its own end with Naganadels and such, so it can normally get out of that Handlock situation quite happily. And again, they can play some Roxy Mimikyu combos as well. They have so many options available to them. They even have Psychic type coverage a lot of the time in their list as tech option Pokemon. And I think the Zacian builds in general are quite awkward. That's something that I think is holding back this sort of defensive Mewtwo build, or disruptive Mewtwo build, I guess is a better way of putting it. We are less explosive than the Welder-based builds, obviously, because we don't scale our attacks like nearly as well. But we try and make up for that by just making our opponent stumble at points and just have really slow turns. But the thing is, with Zacian, even if they're having poor turns, they're still sometimes getting additional energy acceleration, and they're at least drawing 3 cards to end their turn every time with that own Zacian V's ability. So they're never really hand-locked for long. It's not always easy for us to chain that 150 damage because it's not a great number against some of their stuff, especially with Frying Pans and stuff involved in the math. And they're normally playing a lot of healing, so the Trevenant isn't like an ideal option against specifically Zacian. So that's something that I am a little bit concerned of. I do want to try this matchup against Zacian a lot more, because I feel like although the hand disruption is a good option against them, I think they'll normally A, draw out of it at points in games, and B, still be okay to pass turns because of the tankiness that they have. And in certain cases, especially with that Luke Metal, they have resistances and stuff like that on top of everything else. So that's all going to be pretty rough for Mewtwo, so something to bear in mind for sure. On to the closing thoughts. I think this Handlock is really easy. I've played a few games with this deck so far. I even played it on stream tonight, and it seemed that like if either player is using Marnie in their deck, you just at times just use Night Watch and your opponent is just wrecked sometimes, especially if you're like Night Watching to knock out their Jirachi or something, if it's in the early couple of turns where they're just Stellar Wish passing. you can make life very awkward for the opponent for sure. I do think that you could definitely think about patching up your matchup against Mimikyu and the awkward psychic weakness that you do have, instead of just trying to main some of these sort of sideline attackers in those sorts of matchups. I think you could go more defensive with, like I said, the Giant Charm, more Mallow&Lanas, Weak Guard Energies with Guzhala. Those are all options for sure in the deck that I do think are worth exploring. So, yeah, overall, that's what I wanted to bring you today, guys. The really annoying Night Watch sort of Handlock based build of Mewtwo. Do you think it's going to be stronger than Welder? Do you think it's just going to be another Mina Mew 3 build from Japan? Let's not forget that that was one of their most popular builds of Mewtwo when it was first released. And then as soon as we got our hands on the cards, we just threw Mina away and started playing Welder off like out the gates. I'll hear it all down below. Is it just going to be wacky nonsense, or is it going to be a real contender in the format? Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll be back tomorrow with another Sword and Shield deck. So cheers.